The land was tired. You could see it in the color of the soil, in the way the grass bent brittle and yellow beneath the wind's hand. The prairie had once been a place of promise, but by the time folks whispered about Ezekiel Boone, it had become more grave than cradle. The sun hung low and mean, like a sheriff who'd stopped believing in justice. Ezekiel was not a man of grandeur. His shoulders were bent from too many years behind a plow, his beard peppered with gray before its time. He lived alone in a clapboard shack that leaned against the wind as if begging not to fall. The town called him the poor fool farmer, and maybe he was. He had little more than a mule, a few chickens, and a pair of hands that blistered as fast as they healed. But Ezekiel had something most men had long traded away, a heart that still hurt when the world showed its cruelty. It was an evening in late summer, the sky streaked with copper and blood. He had gone looking for his stray mule along the dry wash near the cottonwoods. His boots crunched over stones, his breath heavy, when he caught sight of something that made the air stutter in his chest. Two figures. They lay in the dust, bound with coarse rope, their wrists raw and bleeding. One was no more than 12, the other perhaps 14. Apache girls. Their dark eyes shimmered with fever and fear, their lips cracked from thirst. Flies circled their wounds. Whoever had left them here had done so with intent, that cruel way men sometimes tossed aside what they could not profit from. Ezekiel froze. His first thought was fear. If the town learned he had touched them, much less sheltered them, he'd be branded a traitor to his own kind. Men had been beaten for less. He stood there, sweat rolling down his back, torn between survival and mercy. The older girl, her name he would learn later was Taya, lifted her chin even in weakness. Her eyes met his with a defiance so sharp it near cut him. She was daring him to walk away. The younger, Nalin, was barely breathing. Her small body trembled, her gaze fluttering between worlds. Something inside Ezekiel broke open. He saw in their pain the same thing he saw in his own cracked mirror each morning. A life dismissed, a soul counted as nothing. And in that recognition, his fear lost its teeth. Kneeling in the dust, Ezekiel drew his knife. His hands shook as he sawed through the ropes. The older girl flinched, her body tense like a cornered animal, but he spoke low and steady. "Easy now. I ain't here to harm you." When the bonds fell away, the girls did not run. They had no strength left. Ezekiel lifted Nalin first, light as a bundle of sticks, and then helped Taya stumble to his wagon. His mule, half wild and ornery, brayed at the added burden, but Ezekiel silenced him with a sharp tug. The ride home was quiet but heavy. Each creak of the wagon wheels sounded like a verdict. He felt the weight of unseen eyes, the judgment of neighbors, the whisper of laws written in prejudice. Yet when Nalin's small hand fell limp against his sleeve, he covered it gently with his calloused palm, and shame gave way to something holier. At his shack, he stoked a weak fire and set out what little food he had, cornbread gone stale, beans boiled thin. He soaked rags in water to clean their wounds, his hands clumsy but tender. Taya watched every movement, suspicion burning through her fever, but when Ezekiel bound her wrists with strips of cloth torn from his own shirt, her gaze softened. Just a flicker, but enough to make his throat tighten. Nalin was too weak to speak, yet as he lifted a tin cup of water to her lips, she pressed her fingers against his rough hand. Simple touch. But in that gesture, something wordless passed between them, a trust that neither law nor hatred could undo. The night stretched long. Coyotes sang in the distance. The wind rattled the shutters. Ezekiel sat by the fire, watching the two girls breathe, half afraid they would vanish by dawn. And yet, come morning, strength stirred in their faces. Taya's eyes were clearer, her voice hoarse but steady when she asked in broken English, "Why?" Ezekiel paused, the question heavier than stone. He stared at the cracked earth outside his door, then back at the girl who had survived chains. His answer was quiet, almost ashamed. "'Cause no one else would. They left at sunrise, though not by choice. Ezekiel knew the longer they stayed, the greater the danger, for them and for him. He hitched the mule, loaded them once more into the wagon, and drove toward the foothills where the land grew wild and unforgiving. When they reached the border of Apache country, he stopped. The forest beyond stood like a wall of green shadows, whispering secrets he could never understand. He helped Nalin to her feet, steadied Taya when she wavered. Neither spoke a word of thanks, but neither needed to. As they stepped into the trees, Taya turned once. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes lingered on him a moment longer than chance would allow. Then they disappeared, swallowed by the mist of morning. Ezekiel stood there long after they were gone, the reins slack in his hand. The mule tugged impatiently, but he did not move. His chest ached with a strange hollowness, yet beneath it flickered something he could not name. The prairie wind carried the scent of cedar and rain. For the first time in years, Ezekiel Boone felt the faintest stirrings of hope, though he did not yet know why. The years unspooled like a rope left out in the rain, fraying slow, strand by strand. Ezekiel Boone remained upon that patch of stubborn earth, a man anchored to soil that yielded little more than dust. His farm, once tilled with a dreamer's hope, sagged into ruin. Fence posts leaned, the barn roof buckled, and weeds claimed the fields as though mocking him for every seed that never sprouted. The townsfolk had long made a sport of him. In the saloon, laughter swelled whenever his name was spoken, a punchline tied to poverty. That poor Boone, still scratching dirt that don't want him. Even at church, where mercy was supposed to live, they offered him sideways glances instead of handshakes. To them, Ezekiel was a man who had failed his duty, to build wealth, to raise a family, to leave a mark the world could measure. Yet he stayed. There was nowhere else to go, and perhaps in some secret corner of his soul, he believed that staying itself was a kind of courage. He woke each dawn to the same rituals: water the mule, mend the fence, scratch at the soil, though the soil gave him nothing. At night he sat by the fire, the silence thick around him, broken only by the creak of the windmill outside or the coyotes yipping beneath a harvest moon. And in that silence, ghosts kept him company. The memory of 2 Apache girls, their eyes burning like stars in the dust, haunted him more faithfully than any neighbor. He never spoke their names aloud, Taya and Nalin, yet in the quiet of his shack, he sometimes whispered them, letting the syllables roll on his tongue like prayer. He wondered if they lived, if they grew tall and strong, if they forgot the poor farmer who had risked everything to keep them breathing. Often shame followed such thoughts. He was no savior. His farm was proof enough of that. What good was a man who could not even keep his own soil alive? And yet, in the darker hours, he clung to the memory of Nalin's small hand upon his, the fragile weight of trust. That moment, brief as candle flame, kept him from despair's edge. Still, the world pressed its heel against him. The banker came one summer, dressed in polished boots that shone too bright for this dusty town. He dismounted, looked over the cracked fields, and shook his head as though Ezekiel himself were an eyesore. "If you can't pay by winter," he said, "we'll take the land." Neighbors offered no pity. Jed Barnes, whose fields thrived with corn, spat tobacco in the dirt and muttered, "Should have given up years ago." Clara May, the widow Ezekiel once dared to imagine sharing supper with, walked past him on the boardwalk without a word, her arm linked with another man's. Rejection piled upon rejection, until even the mule seemed to eye him with pity. But Ezekiel carried on, not with grandeur, but with stubborn quiet. He fed a stray dog that limped into his yard one bitter January, sharing what little broth he had. He rescued a sparrow with a broken wing, setting it in a wooden box lined with rags until it healed and flew again. He spoke soft to his mule, patting its neck after long days, as though it were the only living thing still tethered to his side. Each small act, humble, unnoticed, became his rebellion. The world may call him worthless, but Ezekiel refused to harden. One evening, a storm rolled in from the west. Lightning clawed the horizon, thunder split the air. Ezekiel stood on his porch, the wind whipping his coat, and he felt, for the first time in years, a strange peace. The sky itself seemed to rage and mourn with him, as though admitting he was not alone in his grief. He lifted his face to the rain, let it wash the dust from his skin, and in that wild baptism he whispered, "I ain't done yet." Afterward, he sat at his wooden table, a single candle burning. His hands, calloused and cracked, lay folded as though in prayer. And in his mind's eye, he saw them again, Taya's fierce defiance, Nalin's fragile trust. The memory was no longer sharp with pain but softened, like embers glowing low. Perhaps they had forgotten him. Perhaps they lived lives so large his small kindness had been swallowed whole. But the thought did not wound him any more. It steadied him. Because even if they never thought of him again, he knew what he had done, and he knew it mattered. That night, Ezekiel dreamed of the two girls running free through pine forests, their laughter ringing like bells. He woke with tears on his face but also with a strange, quiet pride. The world might never honor him. The town might never forgive his poverty. His name might fade like smoke. But Ezekiel Boone had given life when death reached out. And some part of him, however fragile, trusted that life would answer back, even if he never lived to see it. The years piled on Ezekiel Boone like stones on a cairn. His beard had turned white, his back had bowed, and his hands, once strong enough to hoist wagon wheels, shook when he reached for the coffee pot in the mornings. The farm had shrunk into little more than a shack clinging to the prairie, yet still he stayed. He told himself often that a man was not the measure of his acres or his harvest but of whether he endured. And endure he did, though the cost was solitude so thick it seemed stitched into his very skin. It was an autumn evening when the change came. The horizon, usually quiet as a held breath, began to tremble with a sound long forgotten. Hoofbeats. Not one horse but many. The earth itself quivered beneath their weight. Ezekiel rose from his porch chair, squinting through the deepening dusk. What he saw made his knees falter. A column of riders moved across the plain, torches glowing like stars dragged down from the heavens. At their front rode two figures, tall and regal, clothed in garments of eagle feathers and beads that shimmered with firelight. Their bearing was not of raiders but of kings, or rather of queens. When they drew near, Ezekiel saw the truth. His breath caught and the years fell away. It was them. Taya, her face strong and unyielding, eyes burning with the same fire he once saw in a girl bound by rope. Beside her, Nalin, her presence gentler yet no less powerful, her expression carrying the depth of rivers and storms. They were no longer children, no longer fragile lives in need of saving. They had become something vast, giant chiefs of their people, leaders who carried whole histories in their gaze. Ezekiel stumbled forward, his hands trembling as though afraid the vision might vanish. The two women dismounted with the grace of warriors, yet when they approached, there was something softer in their eyes. "The farmer," Taya said, her voice low, steady, rolling across the prairie like thunder. "The one who gave us life," Nalin added, her voice a river song that carried sorrow and gratitude in equal measure. Behind them the tribe dismounted. And then, in a motion that stole Ezekiel's breath, they knelt. Dozens of proud Apache warriors, their torches bowing toward the earth, honoring not a king, not a general, just a poor farmer whose name the town mocked. Ezekiel felt tears burn his eyes. He had no words, only his heart, pounding with a fullness he had never known. But the moment did not remain unchallenged. From the east, lanterns bobbed in the dark. The townsfolk had gathered, drawn by the thunder of hooves. Sheriff Amos Klein rode at their front, rifle resting across his saddle. Behind him Jed Barnes the banker and half the town, all armed, all afraid. The air tightened. Words of fear cracked the silence. "Indians! Raiders! Drive them out before they take the town." Rifles lifted. Children clutched their mothers' skirts. The prairie itself seemed to hold its breath. Ezekiel, old and bent, stepped between the two worlds. His voice, though thin with age, carried in the charged stillness. No. The rifles wavered. The sheriff squinted at him. Boone, step aside. You don't know what you're standing in front of. But Ezekiel did not move. His frail frame was all that stood between fear and bloodshed. He raised his arms, shaking but firm. I know exactly what I stand before. 15 years ago, I found 2 girls bound and left to die out there in the dust. No one cared. Not this town, not the law, no one. But I did. And now, look what they became. Not enemies. Not thieves. Leaders. Sisters of the earth herself. They remember kindness when the rest of us forgot it. The townsfolk shifted uneasily. Anger warred with shame in their faces. Jed spat into the dirt but kept his rifle lowered. Then Nalin stepped forward. She placed her hand upon Ezekiel's shoulder, just as she had done years ago when her life was slipping away. That small human touch stilled the storm. A memory wordless yet undeniable passed through her fingers into his bones. The rifles lowered. One by one, the townsfolk let the tension drain from their grips. The sheriff said nothing, only tipped his hat and turned his horse away. The rest followed, muttering but subdued. The night wind swept the prairie clean again, carrying the scent of sage and smoke. Taya drew from her saddle a blanket woven with eagle feathers and symbols of her people. She draped it across Ezekiel's shoulders, her eyes steady. You were our beginning, she said. And you are remembered, Nalin whispered. Ezekiel bowed his head, his frail body trembling beneath the honor. All his years of loneliness, of shame and ridicule, all the laughter and scorn he had borne, it melted in that moment. He was no longer the poor fool farmer. He was a man whose quiet mercy had echoed across time. The tribe mounted once more, their torches trailing like comets into the night. Taya and Nalin lingered only long enough to meet his eyes one last time, a silent promise passing between them. Then they too rode into the dark, leaving Ezekiel alone beneath the stars. But he was not empty. For the first time in decades, his chest was light, his heart full. He sat on his porch until dawn, the blanket still across his shoulders. His eyes lifted to the horizon where the sun bled gold into the sky. And as the world awoke, Ezekiel Boone whispered to himself, to the land, and to anyone listening beyond the veil of time. Greatness ain't in riches or in names carved on stone. It's in the small mercies, those no one sees, those no one praises. Plant a seed of kindness, and though you may never live to see it rise, it will grow. And sometimes when the years have worn you down, it returns as giants.